First, she left. I learned the sound of her absence. It arrived quietly, like a draft under a closed door. It arrived in a suitcase, in a short message, in a sentence that looked polite on the surface but hollow inside. She said it wasn't about me. She said the timing was wrong. She said there were opportunities she could not ignore anymore. Opportunity had a face now. A man with expensive watches and calm confidence. A man who owned houses the way other people owned umbrellas. A man whose life looked clean, organized, effortless. I remember standing in the kitchen when she told me. The kettle was boiling and the sound kept going even after she finished speaking. For a moment the room felt like it had been carefully emptied. Like someone had removed the furniture of my future while I was still standing inside it. She packed slowly. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just methodically. Shirts folded. Books stacked. Jewelry wrapped in small cloth bags. I watched like someone watching a quiet evacuation. Every object leaving the room took a version of the past with it. When she closed the suitcase, she looked relieved. Relief is a strange expression when it appears at the end of a marriage. She hugged me the way people hug acquaintances at airports. Polite, brief, careful not to linger. Then she walked out of the apartment that still smelled like the dinners we used to cook together. The silence that followed had weight. I noticed it in the evenings first. Evening used to belong to both of us. Now it sat beside me like an extra chair. I kept routines because routines are a kind of scaffolding. Monday meant groceries. Thursday meant laundry. Sunday meant the window chair and a long look at the street. People asked questions carefully. Friends used voices that were softer than usual. They told me about the man she left with. They described the cars, the parties, the kind of restaurants where the menu doesn't show prices. I listened like someone collecting weather reports from a country I no longer lived in. Sometimes I saw photographs online. Her smiling in rooms full of glass and white flowers. Her standing beside him with the calm posture of someone who had chosen a different map. I told myself that people change. I told myself that love sometimes dissolves quietly like sugar in tea. Months passed in careful increments. I learned new skills. I learned how to cook smaller meals. I learned how to sleep in the center of the bed. I learned how to talk to myself without sounding lonely. One evening, almost exactly a year later, my phone vibrated on the table. I almost ignored it. Late messages usually bring unnecessary complications. But curiosity is a quiet magnet. When I looked at the screen, I saw her name again. 3 simple words appeared in the message. "Can we talk?" The sentence seemed harmless, but it rearranged the entire room. I stared at it for a long moment. A year is enough time to build distance. But sometimes a single message can walk straight through that distance. We met the next day at a small cafe near the river. She arrived early. I could tell because her cup was already half empty. She looked different in subtle ways. Not older exactly, just rearranged. Like someone who had tried living inside a photograph that didn't belong to her. When she saw me, she smiled with careful hesitation. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. Her voice carried the sound of someone practicing honesty. We talked slowly at first. About ordinary things. Weather, work, the neighborhood. Then the conversation circled the real question. She looked down at the table before saying it. "I made a mistake." The sentence landed softly but heavily. She explained that the life she entered had been bright, but strangely empty. There were parties, but no conversations. There were gifts, but no meaning attached to them. The house was enormous, but every room echoed. She said the man had been generous, but distant. Generosity, she learned, is not the same as care. One night she realized something simple and uncomfortable. She had traded a life for a display case. She looked at me carefully before speaking again. "I miss the way things used to feel," she said. I watched the river outside the window while she spoke. Water moved past us with steady patience. Time does the same thing. It moves forward regardless of our decisions. Finally, she said the words that had been waiting behind every sentence. "I want to come back." I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was angry, but because some questions require quiet before they can be understood. A year earlier, she had walked away from the life we built together. Now she was standing at the edge of it again. The strange thing about love is that it doesn't disappear completely. It changes shape. It hides in memory. It waits in ordinary places like kitchens and quiet streets. I finally spoke after a long pause. "Coming back isn't the same as starting again," I said calmly. She nodded slowly. She understood that some doors open differently the second time. We finished our coffee in thoughtful silence. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the river like a patient promise. For the first time in a long while, neither of us rushed the moment. Because sometimes the most important decisions in life are not loud or dramatic. Sometimes they begin quietly with two people sitting across from each other, trying to understand what forgiveness really means. In the weeks that followed, she called twice a week with a voice that practiced apology like a new language. She sent flowers on days that once marked small rituals between us. She mailed letters typed and careful as contracts. Each note was an attempt to measure the distance she had crossed and the ground she hoped to return to. I kept them in a drawer like tickets, small proofs that something had happened and that she had tried to document it. I found myself checking the mailbox as if a past life might arrive like a parcel. Sometimes she visited without announcing it, standing at the doorstep like someone testing if a house still recognized her. When she came, she would stay for an hour and then leave as if returning something borrowed. She learned to ask about small things with the particular humility of someone who had seen her mistakes reflected in someone else's eyes. I learned to listen without promising too much. We rebuilt rituals in modest increments: a shared cup of coffee, a walk to the market, a visit to the library. She offered explanations about her absence that read like itineraries of regret. Sometimes the explanations were precise and careful, other times they were vague as fog. She spoke of evenings that blurred into one another, of obligations that were carefully scheduled and then left unresolved. She confessed to small mistakes she had not expected would matter so much later. She admitted to nights where silence had been mistaken for success. She said she had learned that money could frame a life, but not always fill it. I noticed subtle changes in how she moved through the world. Her laughter had softened, as if it now had to fit into a smaller room. There was a carefulness in the way she reached for things, as if she were learning not to take up space the way she once did. We took long walks along streets that used to feel ordinary and now felt mapped by memory. She would point at a shop window and say, "We used to come here," and I would nod because my memory held the same coordinates. The city around us kept moving, indifferent and steady. People went about their lives like a river that does not stop for anyone. In small ways, I allowed her back into my routines. Sometimes she helped with dishes, and sometimes she left dishes undone as if to show that return is not tidy. She asked about my days and listened in ways that made me cautious, and then, oddly, relieved. One afternoon she brought a small plant and set it on the windowsill. We both watched it for a while as if the act of caring for something living could be proof that we could care for each other again. She confessed that the man she had gone with had a life scheduled down to the minute. There were chauffeurs and assistants and a calendar that decided when he could be kind. His kindness came in appointments. It was generous, but rarely spontaneous. She said she had traded small, messy tenderness for large, curated gestures. She told me about evenings where nothing was asked of her because everything had been arranged for spectacle. She said she missed the quiet work of being present. We spoke about honesty and the new vocabulary it required. Honesty is not only truth, but the willingness to be small and ask for help. It is the choice to show up in ways that are not always impressive, but are reliable. I learned that forgiveness is not a single event, but a set of practices. It is the daily decision to notice and to repair. She began volunteering at a local charity to fill the hours that had once been filled by parties. I went with her sometimes and watched her work with a concentration I had not seen in rooms where she had been an ornament. There was a steadiness in those afternoons that looked like purpose. The man she left with circulated in the edges of our conversations like a weather report. He appeared in photographs on social pages, smiling at events, the kind of presence that registers as a headline. He did not call or interfere. His life moved on in a different orbit. There was no malice in the way our paths crossed, only the awkward geometry of people who had once been close. Sometimes I wondered how we measure regret. Is it in the number of nights spent awake, or in the things we no longer say aloud? I tried to inventory small mercies: a returned sweater, a shared joke, the way she learned to pour tea without spilling. These were not grand penances, but they mattered because they were evidence of attention. People around us noticed the change and offered opinions, some blunt, some gentle. If she truly wanted to come back, you should welcome her, some would say. Others warned that return requires more than words. They suggested terms I should set like boundaries, like clauses in a contract. I considered these as one considers a map, useful, but not the same as walking the terrain. I asked myself whether the practicalities of living together again could be drafted like an agreement. Could we make a list of expectations and sign it as if that would anchor trust? In moments of weakness, that idea felt tempting, a way to paper over the fear of being hurt again. But the truth is that lists do not build tenderness, they only mark what we hope to protect. Tenderness grows in the small, unplanned acts: a repaired collar, a note left on a pillow, a phone call that says nothing more than, "I'm here." We began to test the edges of what return meant. We tried living together for an afternoon, and then took breaks to see how the rhythm felt. Sometimes the old familiarity comforted us. Sometimes it was a reminder of what had been lost. There were quiet conversations about money and space and the roles we had played. She wanted some independence. I wanted clarity. We negotiated small things like whose books would stay on which shelf. The negotiations were, at times, clumsy and earnest. We learned to apologize and to accept apologies without scoring them like debts. Forgiveness turned out to be less theatrical and more practical than I had imagined. It required showing up, paying attention, and sometimes letting go of the right to be vindicated. I found that patience is not a passive virtue but an active choice. It asks that we resist the urge to rewrite the past into a simpler story. The past is a messy ledger and cannot be cleaned with a single sweep. Over time, small routines knitted a new texture into our days. We would walk the dog together, make breakfast on Saturday mornings, and share the chores of a life that felt more mutual than it had before. These were not grand declarations, but they were steady work. Sometimes the old shame surfaced, unexpected and ugly. I would remember the sharpness of a night when she had left, and my throat would tighten. She would see the change in me and offer a hand or a word, and that, in itself, was a kind of balm. There were conversations about the future that required new vocabulary. How do you speak of commitment after a fracture? We tried to be honest about fears and hopes and to let the other speak without interruption. It was a slow education in humility. We discovered that humility is not humiliation, but the capacity to hold one's own errors in view and still attempt better. On the anniversary of her departure, we did not stage a ceremony. Instead, we sat on the couch and read aloud from a book we both loved. There was nothing dramatic about it. It felt like tending a small fire. Friends began to notice a steadying in us, a moderation of the extremes that had once defined our arguments. Some relationships that had been sharp and quick dissolved. Others deepened in ways I did not expect. She reconnected with people she had set aside, and I made new friends who knew how to listen. Occasionally, the man she had been with would appear in a headline, but these notes rarely disrupted our routine. They were weather, not architecture. There were moments when I feared that her leaving had been inevitable and that no return could really change what had been done. But then she would do something small. She would leave the kettle on the stove for me to notice, or fold a napkin the way I liked, and the world would feel less brittle. Gradually, we accumulated new proofs that we were trying in good faith. I found myself less interested in what people thought and more invested in the quiet evidence of our days. There were times when the past intruded, as if memory has a way of testing the present. I would walk past an intersection and remember stands of laughter or a fight that had been particularly sharp. I would feel that old ache and then notice that it softened faster than it once would have. We both agreed eventually that return did not mean erasure. It meant making a different life out of what remained. We learned the economy of apologies and the humble architecture of everyday reliability. We wrote lists not as legal documents but as reminders: call the plumber, schedule a doctor's visit, pick up milk. These lists were strangely sustaining. We started planning small trips again. Not designed to impress, but to be together in places where no one knew our history. We ate at small restaurants where the lights were dim and the service was honest. She learned to accept compliments without shrinking, and I learned to offer them without expectation. There were times when doubt returned like a tide, sudden and certain. In those moments we had new tools. We spoke, we paused, we checked in. We did not pretend the past had not happened. We just refused to let it be the only story. Friends sometimes asked me if I was fully reconciled. I would say that reconciliation is a verb, not a state. It is ongoing, a series of acts that accumulate into something durable. People assume that return must be dramatic, a gesture, a declaration, a vow, but often it is quiet, a repaired window, a shared laugh, a small admission of error. She continued her work with the charity and found new rhythms that fit her differently than before. I watched her grow more patient with herself and less anxious about the shine of a life curated by others. There were still nights when we woke and felt the echo of what had happened, but those echoes faded faster. We made new rules: no late calls without a text, a monthly check-in about finances, honest talk about time spent apart. These were not punitive, but practical. They were scaffolding for trust. I discovered that living together again requires curiosity about how someone has changed and how you yourself have changed. It requires an allowance for awkwardness and an appetite for repair. Sometimes the most ordinary acts felt like courage: making the bed, remembering an anniversary, laughing at something that had once made us fight. The man she had left with receded into the background of our lives like an old season. He no longer defined the contours of our conversation. Instead, we began to build a vocabulary of daily kindness. People began to comment on our steadiness and to ask what changed. I would tell them that change was not a single moment, but the accumulation of small, faithful acts. There were moments of ambivalence, times when the memory of her leaving hit with the bluntness of a winter wind. But these moments grew fewer and shorter. We came to understand that love is not merely the possession of another, but the decision to stay and to keep practicing goodness. The city continued to move around us, indifferent and kind in its own way. We found celebrations that were quieter and more intimate, or we simply celebrated in small ways. A loaf of bread toasted the way she liked it, a film watched together in comfortable silence. I came to appreciate the ordinary textures of life because they required attention and rewarded it. On a bright morning, she said, "I did not know how to be small before, and I understood what she meant." It was both admission and discovery. She taught me new ways of noticing, and I taught her the usefulness of patience. We both learned to measure success not by grandeur, but by consistency. Consistency became our new benchmark. People asked about trust, and I would say that trust is built by noticing where someone keeps their keys, how they treat a cashier, whether they hold a promise even when it is small. Over time, the old wound became less a defining scar and more a part of our shared landscape. It appeared sometimes but rarely dictated the shape of our days. We talked about children and decided to wait and see if our capacity to care for each other could be steady enough to welcome another life. That decision felt honest because it was made slowly and without pressure. We both recognized that the past could inform but should not imprison us. In quiet moments, we would sit by the window and remember small details of the life we had nearly lost. The coffee cup she had left behind sat at the back of a cabinet, and for a long time I kept it there like a talisman. Eventually, she asked if we could use it, and I said yes, because keeping relics can sometimes freeze life in a way that prevents it from moving forward. We hosted a small dinner with friends who had stayed with us through the hard parts and who now saw us as steadier versions of ourselves. The evening was warm and low-key, the kind of gathering that required no performance. Someone raised a glass and said, "To second chances," and we both smiled, the kind of smile that knows both grace and caution. There were still boundaries I kept for safety, certain topics that were better navigated slowly, certain nights when I needed space to process. She respected these, and in respecting them, she proved her commitment in tangible ways. We found new pleasures in each other's company, reading side by side, sharing music, debating small things until we both laughed at how serious we had been. The world did not ask us to prove anything. It only watched as we accumulated ordinary acts of care. Months turned into a year and then another, and the rhythm of our days settled into something calm. People sometimes asked if I ever regretted being open to her return. I would say that regret is a complicated ledger with credits and debits. In the end, I was grateful for the way she came back, not as a restoration of the old exactly, but as a willingness to build something new from the pieces we had left. We learned that love can be humble, and that humility is not defeat. It is recognition that we are all, at core, people making small choices every day. Occasionally, late at night, I would wake and feel the memory of the suitcase, the quiet leaving, and then I would turn and find her beside me. Her breath would be steady and alive, and in that small living proof I found solace. The man with the watches continued his life somewhere else, and we did not follow the headlines. Instead, we focused on the work of being present. Some days were hard and some days were sweet, but each day added to a ledger of ordinary trust. The story of her leaving and coming back became less a dramatic episode and more a teacher. It taught us to be attentive, to set boundaries, and to value consistency over spectacle. In quiet moments, we would talk about what we had learned about ourselves and about each other. We both admitted to faults and to small acts of courage we had not known we possessed. The neighborhood around us felt kinder, not because people had changed, but because our own view had cleared. We found contentment in the small things, the way sunlight hit the table in the morning, the ritual of shared breakfasts, a folded note left on the bedside table. Looking back, I see that return was never a single event, but a sequence of choices, tiny and earnest, that accumulated into a life worth living again. We did not pretend that everything was perfect. Instead, we practiced the discipline of showing up and of repairing where we could. There is a quiet dignity in that work, and in the end it felt like the truest form of intimacy we had ever known. We began to understand that repair is a series of small, stubborn acts rather than a single dramatic confession. She learned to answer my questions without rehearsed phrases, to let honesty be imperfect and immediate. I learned to ask simpler things. How was your day? Did you eat? Do you need a minute? We made room for silence that was not accusation, and that alone felt revolutionary. There were evenings when the old thorns prickled through, an overheard laugh on television, a misplaced receipt, the sudden sight of a photograph that folded open a wound, but those moments, though sharp, were shorter than before. She started keeping a small notebook of the things she felt sorry for and the things she wanted to try to do differently. Sometimes she would show me a page, and we would sit and discuss how to move from list to practice. She took a job that had fewer dinners and more predictable hours so that her presence was not a promise tethered to another's calendar. We negotiated money in a new language, one where transparency meant more than spreadsheets. It meant walking through decisions together and naming the small anxieties that once hid behind polite silences. I insisted on counseling, not as a punishment, but as a place to learn new habits, and she agreed, timidly at first, then with a steadier step. The counselor taught us the value of speaking in lines that could be held. When you do X, I feel Y, and I need Z. These phrases sounded clinical, and then, with use, they became the grammar of new kindness. We practiced them until their edges softened, and they could be used in the kitchen and in the car, and in the small hours before sleep. There were nights when regret became a subject we circled cautiously, both of us wondering whether remorse could ever be enough to change the past's reality. I came to see that remorse is necessary but not sufficient. It must be matched by the labor of consistent presence. She did that labor in ways that did not always look like sacrifice. She learned my coffee the way she used to. She started a playlist of songs that reminded us of early, easy laughter. She learned to notice the small practicalities that make a shared life possible. I noticed my own softening, how I stopped rehearsing hurts into speeches and instead narrated them briefly and then let the room cool. It felt like learning to walk without bracing for a fall. Some of our friends returned to the orbit of our lives, others did not, and we grew less concerned with who stayed and more attentive to what felt true for us. There were weekends when we would take the train to towns neither of us had visited and simply talk about small things, how the baker folded bread, what a particular church bell sounded like at noon, so that the world could be our teacher and not just an audience. In those trips, we practiced gratitude for things that had nothing to do with wealth: a clerk's smile, a child's braids, a bench warmed by sun. The past, when it intruded, often came as a test. An advertisement showing a life we used to imagine, a chance encounter with someone who remembered the way things had been. Our response to those tests became the true measure of our work. We discovered that forgiveness is not a gift given once and then shelved. It is a horizon we walk toward together and occasionally retreat from, and that motion is not failure, but the work of being human. She sometimes feared that the man with the watches would return like a weather front and unsettle the calm we had built. I sometimes feared that my own caution would harden into something unlovely, a perpetual ledger of slights. We spoke about those fears openly and awkwardly, and that awkwardness itself became a way to rehearse trust. We made practical agreements. No secret accounts, open calendars for certain weekends, a rule that any significant purchase would be discussed, and those agreements were less about policing and more about mutual respect. When her former life showed up in the form of invitations or charity events, we declined a small number and attended the rest together, not as a performance but as a choice to be present in the same room with the same set of values. There were moments when I wanted to be grand and demand tokens of contrition, and moments when she wanted to erase by doing only the things she thought might please me. Slowly we learned that neither dramatic displays nor constant appeasement built what we needed. What built it was a series of ordinary habits: returning calls, asking about each other's fatigue, fixing a leak because the other hated the sound of dripping, admiring a small success and meaning it. Over time, our laughter returned with a new texture, less careless perhaps, more knowing, and the house filled again with the incidental noises of two people who had learned to be content with smaller, truer pleasures. We began to host friends again, but the parties were quieter, with food that could be eaten without ceremony and conversations that did not require applause. People noticed that we were steadier and asked how we had managed it, and sometimes the answer was simply, "We chose to keep trying," which sounded less dramatic than a headline but was truer. Months moved into years, and we marked them not with grand anniversaries at ballrooms, but with small rituals: a note tucked into a coat pocket before a long day, a shared loaf of bread, the way she learned to leave a light on when I worked late. Our conversations matured into an ease where we could speak of longings without panic and of disappointments without accusation. There were times when we discussed whether to have children, and we did not rush the decision. We both wanted to be sure that whatever life we offered would be anchored in reliability and not in romance alone. The question itself, can we be steady enough, was more important than the answer. In quieter moments, lying awake, I sometimes thought about the man with the watches and felt only relief that life had pushed us toward authenticity rather than spectacle. I thought about how easy it is to be seduced by surfaces and how difficult it is to be seduced by the slow, dull work of showing up. The city did not change its face for us. It carried on, indifferent, and in that indifference we found a kind of permission to live without performance. One spring morning she made pancakes and forgot the sugar, and we laughed until our sides hurt. In that laughter was the sound of a life that had moved past the pressure of proving itself. The story of her leaving and coming back remained a chapter we visited sometimes, a cautionary tale and a teacher, but it no longer defined every room. Instead, it was a seam in the fabric of our days, a line that reminded us where we had been and how careful we now needed to be with each other's hearts. In the end, what felt most honest was not a grand reconciliation, but a quieter truth, that two people could choose every morning to keep trying, and that those small choices, made faithfully, could add up to a life that, while imperfect, felt possible and eventually safe.